Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
So today we're doing something a little bit different. Usually we'll pick up a book that explains a pretty specific system, right? The global economy or AI or maybe how cities are designed.
Right, a focused slice of the world.
Exactly. But the text we're looking at today, it claims to be the explanation for, well, for almost everything about America.
We are definitely diving into the deep end. We're talking about the 1619 Project, a new origin story edited by Nikole Hannah-Jones.
This is, I think it's safe to say, the book that has probably sparked more intense dinner table arguments, more school board showdowns, and even actual state legislation than any other single publication in, what, the last 20 years?
Oh, easily. It's the radioactive one. And I'll be totally honest, when I first picked it up, I had my guard way up.
Of course.
Because you hear so much noise about this book before you even read a single page. You hear it's anti-American, or you hear it's the only truth that matters, or you hear it's pure propaganda.
And that's precisely why we need to do this. Our goal here is to strip all of that away. We are not here to relitigate the culture wars.
No.
We're not trying to decide who's a good patriot and who's a bad patriot. We are here to do what we always do.
Look at the system.
Look at the system.
And the central question of this book, the thing Nikole Hannah-Jones and her whole team are really asking, is, at its core, a systems engineering question. It's this: how do national origin stories function as operating systems?
I love that analogy, the operating system. But let's push on it for a second just to make sure we're not just using a buzzword. When we talk about an OS in technology, we mean the foundational code that runs in the background.
Right. You don't really see iOS or Windows most of the time. You see the apps.
Yeah.
You see your browser, you see your spreadsheet, you see the game you're playing.
But, and this is the key part, the OS defines what those apps can do. It sets the boundaries. It defines the logic.
It determines who has administrator privileges and who is just a guest user. It decides how resources get allocated.
Exactly. So now, let's map that concept onto a nation. The apps are things like our healthcare system, the housing market, the criminal justice system, the whole economy. We interact with those every single day.
Sure.
But the book argues that all those apps are running on a hidden source code, an origin story that defines their logic.
And for as long as I've been alive, and for generations before that, the default assumption has been that the United States is running on an operating system that was installed in 1776.
We could call it the Liberty OS.
The Liberty OS, right. The source code is all men are created equal. And so if we see things in society that don't align with that code, things like slavery or Jim Crow,
Right.
or the massive wealth gap we see today, we interpret those as bugs.
As glitches.
Yeah, we say, oh, the system is crashing. This isn't how it's supposed to work. We need to install a patch.
But the entire premise of the 1619 project is to ask a really unsettling question. What if we just have the installation date wrong? What if the operating system wasn't installed in 1776? What if the core code was actually written in August of 1619?
And if the start date is 1619, then that fundamentally changes the logic of the bugs.
Precisely. Because if the system was founded on the practice of bondage rather than the ideal of freedom, then the inequalities we see today, who has wealth, who holds power, who is disproportionately in prison, that isn't a system crash.
It's the system running exactly as it was designed to.
It's a feature, not a bug.
And that is a truly terrifying thought. Because you can't debug a feature. You have to rewrite the whole program.
And that right there is why this matters so much right now. The conflict you see in American politics, the constant yelling on cable news, the deep polarization, it isn't really just about tax rates or healthcare policy. Those are surface-level disputes.
The arguments about the apps.
Exactly. But the real fight is over legitimacy. It's a fight over which version of history is real, because the origin story is what legitimizes who holds power today.
I see. So if the origin story is 1776, then the current power structure is, fundamentally legitimate. Maybe it needs some tweaking, some reforms, but the foundation is sound.
Yeah.
But if the origin is 1619, then the current power structure is what the book might call the fruit of a poison tree.
And that doesn't just call for reform. That logically leads to a demand for a complete system reformatting, a reboot. And that is why this text feels so profoundly destabilizing to so many people. It isn't just a history lesson. It's a direct challenge to the legitimacy of the current American order.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's unpack the mechanics of the argument the book is actually making. And to do that, we should probably start with the architect herself, Nikole Hannah-Jones. This project didn't start out as a book, did it?
No, not at all. It began as a special issue of the New York Times Magazine. It came out in August 2019 to mark the 400th anniversary of the arrival of that first ship carrying enslaved Africans to Virginia.
And it was huge, even then. I remember seeing it.
Oh, it was massive. It combined journalism, history, poetry, photography, fiction. But the book, the version we're talking about today, allowed them to go so much deeper. They brought in a whole team of esteemed historians and scholars to really build out the core thesis with rigorous academic support.
And in the introduction, she tells this one story about her own education that really, really stuck with me.
High school story.
Yeah. She talks about being in high school, I think in the 90s, and she's taking a Black Studies elective. And the teacher gives her a book called Before the Mayflower by an author named Lerone Bennett Jr.
A foundational text in Black history, a classic.
Right. And she's reading it, and she sees this date, 1619, and she describes this moment of just total confusion because she, like pretty much all of us, was taught that the American story begins with the Mayflower in 1620.
With the Pilgrims,
Yeah.
religious freedom, the Mayflower Compact.
The city on a hill, all of that, that's the starting point in the national memory.
It's page 1.
Exactly. But here in this book is this other ship, the White Lion, arriving a full year earlier. And it's not carrying pilgrims seeking freedom, it's carrying human captives destined for a life of bondage.
And that creates this moment of profound cognitive dissonance. Why was 1620 the date that every single school child was forced to memorize, while 1619 was almost completely erased?
She calls it a purposeful amnesia.
And it has to be purposeful, because
Yeah.
the choice of a start date isn't just a trivial fact. The start date tells you what the story's supposed to be about.
Right. If you start in 1620 with the Pilgrims, the story is about a noble quest for religious liberty and self-governance.
But if you start in 1619 with the White Lion arriving at Point Comfort, Virginia, well, that's a very different story. That story is about exploitation, brutal capitalism, and the deliberate creation of a racial caste system.
And her realization, which becomes the thesis for the entire project, is that you can't just treat 1619 as a sidebar. You can't say, oh, the story is 1776. And by the way, there was also this unfortunate thing called slavery.
You can't treat it as an asterisk.
No. The argument is that 1619 isn't the sidebar, it's the primary engine.
It's the classic feature not a bug argument. The book's thesis is that slavery and the anti-Black racism required to justify it shaped the nation's economic success, its political structures like the Electoral College, its legal systems, its policing, its music, its culture, everything.
So the claim is that you literally cannot understand the United States of America without understanding that it was built on a foundational contradiction: the simultaneity of freedom and slavery.
They were born in the same cradle at the same time.
Okay, let's get into the gears of this machine. We've broken this deep dive down at 4 core insights from the text. And I want to start with the one that I think is foundational to the whole thing. Insight number 1, origin stories as legitimizing infrastructure.
This takes us right back to that ship, the White Lion. Let's actually set the scene. It's late August, 1619. A ship appears off the coast of the English colony of Virginia, near a place called Point Comfort.
And this wasn't just a merchant ship.
No, it was an English privateer ship, which is, a polite term for a state-sanctioned pirate.
Pirates. I feel like that detail gets left out of the story a lot.
Oh, it's a completely wild story. These English pirates had attacked a Portuguese slave ship, the San Juan Bautista, which was in the Gulf of Mexico. They stole about 60 enslaved Africans from that ship and then sailed for Virginia.
So they were pirates who stole human cargo from other human traffickers.
Yes. And when they arrived in Virginia, they were starving. They were out of food, out of supplies. They had no money. So the ship's captain traded, and the historical record says 20 and odd of the Africans for food and supplies from the colonists.
And that single transaction trading human beings for food, that's the seed of the whole system.
It is the seed. But what's really fascinating and what the book points out is that in 1619, the legal and social concept of race as we know it today didn't really exist yet.
What do you mean?
Well, these first Africans were sold into labor, but the rigid legal structure of chattel slavery, the idea that you are property forever and your children are born into property forever based solely on your ancestry, that legal framework had to be invented. It wasn't automatic.
So the colonists had to spend the next century actually building that legal infrastructure. They had to write the code.
They absolutely did. They had to create a whole new set of laws. For example, they passed a law that said if a child is born to an enslaved woman and a free Englishman, that child follows the condition of the mother.
Which was a total reversal of English common law.
A complete 180. In England, status always followed the father, but they deliberately flipped the law in the colonies for a very specific economic reason.
It ensured that the rape of enslaved women by their owners would produce more property for the owner, not free children who could claim an inheritance.
Exactly. It is profoundly dark, but it shows you the system being built brick by brick, law by law.
They were writing the operating system.
That's it. They created a caste system where black became legally synonymous with slave and white became legally synonymous with free. And this brings us right to insight number 2, which, for me, was arguably the most paradigm-shifting part of the whole book.
I think I know which one you're talking about.
Slavery as an economic operating system.
Yes. This is the chapter by the sociologist Matthew Desmond. And I have to admit, before reading this, I had a very specific mental image of slavery. I was thinking, Gone with the Wind.
Sure. Big white pillars, Spanish moss, a sort of lazy, backward, agrarian lifestyle.
Exactly. A pre-modern system. I had this idea that the North was this bustling, modern, capitalist engine of innovation, and the South was this sleepy, inefficient aristocracy that was just destined to die out because it wasn't business savvy.
The feudalism myth.
Right. But Desmond takes an absolute sledgehammer to that entire idea.
He argues the complete opposite. He says the slave labor plantation wasn't a backward, pre-modern institution. It was the prototype of the modern American corporation. It wasn't backward. It was terrifyingly modern.
So what's the evidence for that? Because corporation makes me think of data, spreadsheets, efficiency metrics.
And that is exactly what the planters had. If you look at the historical archives, and the book actually reproduces images of these accounting ledgers, the planters were obsessed with data, utterly obsessed. They tracked the productivity of every single enslaved person down to the decimal point. They had depreciation schedules for human beings, just like a company today has a depreciation schedule for a laptop or a fleet of delivery trucks.
Wait, depreciation schedules for people. Can you unpack that? That phrase just makes my skin crawl.
It should. It means they would calculate the peak value of an enslaved field hand, usually in their late teens or early 20s, and then they would calculate how much that person's value depreciated each year as their body broke down from the labor.
So they were treating human beings as disposable assets.
As capital equipment. They even tracked what they called the sucklers gang, which were nursing mothers, and they calculated in dollars and cents exactly how more productivity they lost in picked cotton for every minute a mother spent nursing her child.
That's monstrously meticulous.
It is, but the most disturbing innovation, the one that really drove the profits, was a management technique they called the pushing system.
Okay. Break that down for us. What is the pushing system?
So, in the traditional, simplified view of slavery, we think, okay, they force people to work and they beat them if they didn't. And that's true, of course. But it was far more systematic than just random cruelty. It was an algorithm.
An algorithm for torture.
You could call it that. Each enslaved person was given a daily quota for picking cotton. Let's say your quota for the day is 100 pounds. If you pick exactly 100 pounds, you're safe for the night. If you pick 90 pounds, you get whipped.
Okay, that makes a horrible kind of sense.
But here is the innovation. If you pick 110 pounds, if you exceed your quota, you don't get a bonus, you don't get a thank you. Your quota for the next day becomes 111 pounds.
So they were constantly systemically testing the absolute physical limit of the human body.
Every single day. It was a system designed to extract the maximum possible caloric output from a human being before their body completely collapsed. And it worked. Productivity on the cotton plantation skyrocketed in the early 1800s, not because of better technology, not because of the cotton gin, but because of the system of managed terror.
And the book makes the crucial point that this incredible wealth wasn't just enriching the South.
No, and this is where that whole narrative of the North is innocent just completely crumbles. Where did all that brutally efficient cotton go?
It went to the textile mills in the North.
Lowell, Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Rhode Island, New York. The Industrial Revolution, the very thing we associate with northern ingenuity and free labor, was fueled by the raw material produced by the pushing system.
So the two systems were totally intertwined.
Completely. But it goes even deeper than that, into the heart of the financial sector, into Wall Street.
This is the idea of human capital, but taken to its most literal extreme.
Absolutely. Enslaved people were not just laborers, they were financial assets.
Hmm.
If you were a planter in Mississippi and you wanted to expand your operation, you didn't just have land as an asset, you had human bodies, and you could mortgage those bodies.
You could actually take a mortgage out on a person.
Yes, you would go to a bank, put up 10 enslaved people as collateral, and get a loan. You'd use that cash to buy more land and more enslaved people. And those mortgages, they were then bundled together into bonds, into securities.
Wait, you're talking about mortgage-backed securities. Like,
Yeah.
what caused the 2008 financial crisis?
Exactly like 2008. These slave-backed bonds were sold to wealthy investors in New York, in London, in Amsterdam. So you had bankers on Wall Street and aristocrats in Europe who could claim they owned no slaves, but their entire investment portfolio was built on the value of enslaved bodies in the American South.
So the entire Western financial system was complicit and deeply invested in the plantation economy.
It was completely entangled. So when Matthew Desmond says slavery was the engine of American capitalism, he means it. He argues that the reason the United States overtook Great Britain as the world's dominant economic superpower wasn't just Yankee ingenuity.
It was the ability to dominate the global cotton market through the most ruthlessly efficient, brutal labor system the modern world had ever seen.
Yes. And the book argues that the DNA of what we call low-road capitalism today, the relentless focus on maximizing profit, minimizing labor costs, and treating workers as disposable inputs, that DNA comes directly from the plantation. It comes from 1619.
That completely reframes the economic history I was taught. But now let's pivot to the political history. Because if the economy was built on slavery, the political system had to be designed to protect it.
It had to be.
And this brings us to insight number 3, the politics of fear and independence.
Okay, this is the third rail. This is the part of the 1619 project that made people the most furious.
I can imagine.
The book argues that one of the primary motivations for the American Revolution, for the colonists declaring independence from Britain, was to protect the institution of slavery.
Which, on the surface, sounds like a wild conspiracy theory if you've only ever heard the Boston Tea Party version of the story. You know, no taxation without representation.
Right. And to be very clear, the book does not say it was the only reason. Of course, things like taxes and political philosophy mattered, but it argues that for the southern colonies, protecting slavery was a critical tipping point.
Okay, so what's the evidence for that claim?
To understand it, we have to look at a very specific moment in 1775, a document called the Dunmore Proclamation.
And who was Dunmore?
Lord Dunmore was the royal governor of Virginia, appointed by the king. It's November of 1775. The white colonists are getting more and more rebellious. George Washington is organizing the Continental Army. Dunmore is in Virginia, he's outnumbered, and he's starting to panic. So he decides to play a card that changes the entire game.
And what does he do?
He issues a proclamation declaring martial law across Virginia, and then he drops an absolute bombshell. He declares that any enslaved person owned by a rebellious colonist who manages to flee their master and join the British Army will be granted their freedom.
Wow. So the British Empire, the tyrants in our history books, are the ones offering emancipation.
As a military strategy, yes. And you have to understand the geography of fear in the colonial South. In colonies like South Carolina, enslaved black people actually outnumbered white people.
Right.
The primal #1 fear of the Southern gentry was a massive slave revolt, a servile insurrection. They lived in constant terror of it. They slept with pistols under their pillows.
So when the highest-ranking British official in Virginia says, "We will arm your slaves and set them free if they agree to fight you,"
It confirmed their absolute worst nightmare. It was proof, in their eyes, that the British Empire could no longer be trusted to protect their property, their human property. In fact, Britain was now an existential threat to that property.
So for a man like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, both of whom were Virginians and massive slaveholders, fighting for liberty also meant fighting for the liberty to control their own society, which for them inherently included the right to own other people.
That's the paradox the book presents. It argues that this fear drove the southern colonies, who were some of the wealthiest in the empire, into the arms of the revolution. Without that direct threat to the institution of slavery, they might have stayed loyal to the crown. The Dunmore Proclamation tipped the scales.
It just adds such a deeply uncomfortable layer of irony to 1776. They were shouting, "Give me liberty or give me death," but part of that liberty was the freedom to keep other human beings in chains.
It creates the central paradox of the American founding. And that leads us directly to the book's fourth major insight. If the founders were, in part, fighting to protect slavery, then who is actually fighting to expand democracy?
This is the part of the book that I actually found the most hopeful in a strange way.
I agree.
The concept of Black Americans as the perfecters of democracy.
Nikole Hannah-Jones writes about this as the ideal versus the lie. The Declaration of Independence contains this beautiful, world-changing ideal. All men are created equal. Now, we know from the historical record that Jefferson did not intend for that to include Black men.
Or women. Or Native Americans.
Or landless white men, for that matter. In practice, it was a lie, or at least a very, very narrow truth.
But the argument in the book is that Black Americans, from the very beginning, took that lie and treated it as a sacred promise.
They believed in the words more than the men who wrote them ever did. The book makes the powerful case that the democratic rights we all take for granted today, universal voting rights, birthright citizenship, the basic concept of civil rights, were not gifts generously handed down by the founders. They were wrestled away from the system inch by bloody inch through generations of Black resistance.
The 14th Amendment is the prime example here, right?
It is the absolute linchpin of modern American democracy. After the Civil War, the country faced a huge question. What do we do with 4 million formerly enslaved people? Are they citizens? Do they have rights?
And the 14th Amendment's answer was an unequivocal yes.
Yes, it established birthright citizenship. If you are born on U.S. soil, you are a citizen. Period. Full stop.
A concept that was absolutely not in the original Constitution.
No. The original Constitution had the Three-Fifths Compromise, which counted enslaved people as partial human beings for political representation. The 14th Amendment was a second founding. It rewrote the operating system.
And here's the key point the book makes. Once that new code was written into the Constitution to protect Black people, it expanded liberty for everyone else.
Can you explain how that worked?
Well, think about immigrant communities. If your family comes from Ireland or Vietnam or Mexico, and you have a child in the United States, that child is automatically a U.S. citizen. Why?
Because of the 14th Amendment.
Exactly, because of the code that was written specifically to guarantee the citizenship of the formerly enslaved. The same goes for the women's suffrage movement, the fight for LGBTQ rights. All of these movements for liberation leverage the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
So the argument is that Black struggle kicked the door to democracy open, and many other groups were then able to walk through it. That's the essence of it. Black Americans perfected the democracy that was originally designed to exclude them.
Okay, so we have the history. We have the economics, the politics, the legal shifts. Now I want to zoom out and do what we do best here at the show. Explicit systems mapping. Let's map this crisis in perception. Who are the actors that, according to the book, keep this 1619 operating system running today?
Well, you have the obvious ones, like state institutions, but the book points to some less obvious actors. For instance, the medical establishment.
This is the chapter by Linda Villarosa.
Yeah.
And I'll say it's one of the hardest chapters to read in the entire book.
It's brutal. It explores how the very concept of biological race was invented to justify slavery. In the 19th century, pro-slavery doctors and scientists needed to prove that Black people were physiologically different from and inferior to white people to justify the brutal labor conditions.
So I just made things up.
They published scientific studies claiming that Black people had thicker skin, that they were immune to certain kinds of pain, or that they had weaker lungs.
Weaker lungs, what was the justification for that?
There was a prominent physician named Samuel Cartwright who used a device called a spirometer to measure lung capacity, and he essentially rigged his data to prove that Black people had lower lung capacity than whites. He then argued that the only way to vitalize their blood was through forced outdoor labor in the hot sun.
That sounds like disgusting pseudoscience that we would have left behind in 1860.
You would think so. But Villarosa's reporting traces how that specific fraudulent data point, the idea that Black people have inherently lower lung capacity, got baked into medical textbooks.
Okay.
It persisted for over a century. And even today, there are modern medical algorithms used by hospitals and insurance companies that include a race correction factor.
Wait, are you serious? A race correction in modern software?
Yes. For assessing kidney function, for assessing lung function. The algorithm automatically assumes a Black patient has a different physiological baseline than a white patient. This can lead to Black patients being denied care or kidney transplants because the algorithm doesn't deem them sick enough yet.
So the 1619 operating system is literally running in the code of a modern hospital's diagnostic software.
It is embedded in the system. And we see the same thing in the education system, right? The way we teach this history. The book gives examples of modern textbooks that refer to enslaved people as workers, or in one infamous case, as immigrants.
Immigrants. As if they voluntarily bought a ticket on a ship to come to America for a better life.
It's a subtle but powerful linguistic trick. By using a neutral word like immigrant, you imply consent. You imply agency. You erase the violence and the coercion. It's a way to preserve the innocence of the national narrative.
Which leads directly to the incentives. Why do we keep doing this? Why is the system so incredibly resistant to just looking at the unvarnished truth?
Well, there are economic incentives for sure, but the book suggests the psychological incentives are even more powerful. It talks about the concept of the wages of whiteness.
That's a concept from W.B. Du Bois, right?
Yes. The idea is this. If you're a poor white person in America, you might be struggling. You might be getting exploited by the same low-road capitalism that is also hurting black people. But the system offers you a form of payment that isn't cash. It offers you a psychological wage status.
It tells you, no matter how bad things get for you, at least you are not black.
At least you're not at the bottom of the hierarchy. It's a floor that you can't fall below.
And that status is entirely dependent on maintaining the racial hierarchy.
Exactly. If you're forced to admit that the hierarchy is based on a historical crime, on theft and violence and lies, then you lose that psychological wage.
Yeah.
You lose your sense of inherent superiority or legitimacy within the system.
And this creates these vicious feedback loops that the book describes.
Yeah.
To start with the myth of black inferiority created to justify slavery.
Right. That myth then leads to discriminatory policy things like redlining, which denied black families access to federally backed mortgages or excluding black veterans from the GI Bill after World War II.
That policy then creates real, measurable inequality, a massive generational wealth gap between white and black families.
And this is the crucial final step in the loop, we look at that visible inequality with our amnesiac eyes. We see black poverty, but we've conveniently forgotten the decades of policy that caused it.
So we blame the victims.
We invent new myths. We say it must be their culture, it must be their behavior, it's a pathology, which of course reinforces the original myth of inferiority, and the wheel just keeps on turning.
And disrupting that wheel, challenging the myth at its root, that's what makes a project like this feel so threatening to people.
It's terrifying to the status quo, because if you admit the cause of the inequality is systemic, then the solution must also be systemic. It logically leads to demands for repair, for reparations. The argument becomes, if the government broke it over centuries, the government has a responsibility to fix it, and that is expensive, and it fundamentally shifts power.
Let's talk more about those present-day implications. The book explicitly connects this long history to the physical world we inhabit right now. The chapter on traffic by the historian Kevin Kruse absolutely blew my mind.
It's a masterclass in systems thinking. We all drive on interstate highways every day. We think of them as neutral infrastructure. They're just concrete and asphalt to get us from point A to point B.
Sure.
But Kruse argues that the construction of the interstate highway system in the mid-20th century was one of the most powerful tools of segregation ever designed.
How can you segregate a population with a highway?
Well, in the 1950s and 60s, when federal planners were deciding where to route these massive new interstates through cities, they had to bulldoze huge swaths of land. And in city after city, Atlanta, Detroit, New Orleans, Miami, you name it, the planners deliberately routed the highways directly through the heart of thriving black neighborhoods.
So they targeted these communities.
They explicitly targeted them. The official term was slum clearance, or urban renewal, but it was so common that it earned the nickname Negro removal. They destroyed the economic centers of black urban life. In Detroit, they paved a highway right over a neighborhood called Black Bottom, which was a legendary hub of black-owned businesses and culture.
And it wasn't just about destruction, it was also about creating separation.
That's the other side of it. In Atlanta, for instance, Interstate 20 was routed specifically to act as a permanent physical barrier between the historically white communities to the north and the historically black communities to the south. It was a wall made of traffic and concrete.
So if you live in those neighborhoods today, you are still dealing with the consequences, the pollution from the traffic, the noise, the fact that your neighborhood is cut off and lacks walkability.
And you're dealing with the lack of generational wealth because your grandfather's thriving business was bulldozed 50 years ago to make way for that highway. The racism is literally embedded in the asphalt.
That's a chilling thought.
You can repeal a segregation law with the stroke of a pen. You cannot easily move an 8-lane interstate highway. That is the permanence of the system.
This all brings us back to the central theme of our show, the crisis in perception. The crisis is that we're all trying to navigate a world where the map we've been given just doesn't match the terrain we're on.
That is a perfect way to put it. We have a map that says equal opportunity and meritocracy. We have a map that says liberty and justice for all, but we are driving on terrain that was shaped by 1619. We are driving on what the poet Langston Hughes called the great mistake.
The rock on which freedom stumped its toe.
And because our map is wrong, we keep crashing. We have this intractable polarization. We have this deep-seated anger because we can't even agree on what reality is. We're arguing about two completely different maps.
And the book argues that to cope with this, we engage in this purposeful amnesia. We just collectively agree to skip the bad parts of the story.
We do the quantum leap theory of American history. We teach about Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves. Then maybe we spend a week on the Civil War. And then, whoosh, we jump straight to Martin Luther King Jr. giving his I Have a Dream speech in 1963.
We just skip the 100 years in between.
We skip the entire period known as the nadir of race relations. We skip the rise of the KKK, the thousands of lynchings, the system of convict leasing, which was slavery by another name, the redlining of entire cities, the burning of Black Wall Street in Tulsa.
And by skipping all of that, we make the civil rights movement seem like a simple victory lap instead of what it actually was. A desperate life-or-death struggle to stop a century of relentless bleeding.
We erase the system so the problem looks like it's just about individual hearts and minds.
We're coming toward the end of our time here, and I want to land on the conclusion of the book, because despite how incredibly heavy all of this is, the violence, the brutal economics, the cynical politics, Nikole Hannah-Jones ends on a note that is surprisingly and profoundly patriotic. But it's a very different kind of patriotism.
It all comes down to the story of the flag.
Yeah. She tells this beautiful story about her father. He was a veteran of the Army. He worked as a city bus driver. He was a black man who was born in a sharecropper's cabin in Mississippi. He had, by any objective measure, every single reason to hate America.
He had lived through the absolute worst of it.
And yet, she says that every single morning, her father would go out to their front yard and he would raise this pristine American flag on a tall aluminum pole.
And as a kid, she was just deeply embarrassed by this. She didn't get it. She'd look at her dad and think, why? Why are you honoring a country that treats you like a second-class citizen? Why are you submitting to them?
It must have felt like he was being a chump, you know?
Exactly. But she says that through the long process of researching and writing this project, she came to realize she had it completely wrong. Her father wasn't submitting. He was claiming.
He was saying, this flag is mine.
He was saying, this country is mine. He knew instinctively what the book's argument proves historically, that Black Americans, through their stolen labor, through their shed blood, and through their unwavering loyalty to the ideals of the country, even when the country constantly betrayed them, have earned the right to that flag more than almost anyone else.
Because they were the ones who actually forced the country to live up to its own creed. They were the ones who made America a democracy.
Precisely. The book's final argument is that democracy isn't a static inheritance that we got from the founders, like a family trust fund. It's a construction project. And the people who have done the heaviest lifting for 400 years have been the very people who were left out of the original blueprints.
That is such a powerful and complete shift in perception. It turns the people often cast as victims of the American story into the primary architects of its greatness.
And it leaves us, the reader, with a choice. The book ends with this really powerful concept of inheritance.
I love this framing. It's so useful.
Because we so often hear people today say, well, I didn't own slaves. My family came here from Italy in 1920. Why is this my problem? Why should I feel guilty?
It's the #1 defense mechanism, right? The guilt question.
And the book's answer is, it's not about guilt. It's about inheritance. When you become a citizen of a nation, you inherit all of it. You inherit the assets. You inherit the national parks, the interstate highway system, the stable banking system, the global geopolitical power. You don't say, well, I didn't personally carve the Grand Canyon, so I refuse to visit it. You accept the asset.
But with the assets come the debts.
With the assets come the debts. You inherit the national debt, and you inherit the historical debts. You inherit the consequences of redlining. You inherit the polarization caused by unresolved history. You don't have to be personally guilty of the original sin to be responsible for the cleanup. We are the executors of the national estate.
And we have to manage the whole portfolio, the good and the bad, 1776 and 1619.
We have to be able to hold them both at the same time. The book argues that's the only way to actually see the system clearly enough to begin to fix it.
That is a profound and challenging place to leave it. We are all managing the portfolio.
It's a heavy portfolio, but it's ours.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind crisis and perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.